Hey friends, I want to start this conversation in a place that might feel a little familiar to some of you because it definitely does for me. There's this quiet pattern that can form over time where you learn how to read a room before you ever say a word. You learn how to adjust, soften, and stay agreeable, not because you don't have thoughts or opinions, but because somewhere along the way it just felt easier to keep things calm rather than to risk what might happen if you didn't. And for a while, it can look like maturity, it can look like kindness, it can even look like wisdom. But underneath it, there's often something else happening. You have this internal calculation that starts running without you even realizing it. What's the safest response here? What keeps things from escalating? What keeps everyone okay? And maybe you don't even think of it as shrinking. Maybe you just think of it as being easy, being low maintenance, being someone who doesn't cause problems. I think for a lot of us, especially if we grew up in environments where emotions could get big or unpredictable, we didn't just learn how to be peaceful, we learned how to stay small. And if I'm being honest, this is something I didn't even realize I was doing for most of my life. It didn't feel like a strategy. It didn't feel like a pattern. It just felt like who I was. The one who keeps things together, the one who doesn't make waves, the one who figures out things quietly and moves on. But over time, that kind of living starts to cost you something. And not in loud, obvious ways, in the quiet ones, in the things you don't say, in the parts of you that stay hidden, in the moments where you had something to offer but chose silence instead. So today I want to talk about something that I think runs deeper than we even realize. What happens when you learn to shrink in order to keep the peace? If I trace this back in my own life, I can see how early this pattern started to form, even if I didn't have the language for it at the time. I grew up around a lot of big emotions, a lot of grief, and when I say big, I don't just mean big. I don't just mean expressive. I mean the kind that could shift a room really quickly depending on what was said or how it was received. And as a kid, you start to notice these things long before you understand them. You learn how to read tone, facial expressions, pauses in conversation. You learn what creates tension and what helps things settle. And over time, without anyone ever sitting you down to explain it, you begin to adjust yourself accordingly. I think somewhere along the way, I learned that it was easier to be agreeable, easier to keep things to myself than to risk what might happen if I didn't. When I spoke up or shared how I felt, it didn't always land well, and depending on the situation, it could turn into something bigger than I ever intended. So instead of trying to navigate those reactions, I learned how to avoid them. Being good didn't look like being expressive or opinionated. It didn't look like asking a lot of questions or pushing back. It looked like being easy, keeping to myself, not sharing too many ideas or thoughts unless I was absolutely sure that they would be received well. A lot of my time was spent in books, getting lost in stories with strong character development, where I could disappear into someone else's world instead of trying to make sense of my own. I was often around adults at the softball fields where my mom and aunt played on a league, listening more than speaking and observing more than participating. And something else that shaped this in a really specific way for me was the fact that I was navigating more than one version of belonging at the same time. On one side of my family, I was the only child, which meant I carried a certain kind of presence in that space, more attention, more awareness, and often a stronger sense of how my own actions and responses might affect the emotional tone around me. On the other side, I was the youngest of my dad's children for most of my early life, and then later, in my mid-20s, I became the middle child when my younger siblings were born. That shift didn't feel dramatic in the moment, but it added a whole nother layer to how I understood where I fit. Depending on where I was learning slightly different versions of how to exist. In one space, I learned to stay calm and agreeable so things didn't escalate. And in another, I learned how to fit in without drawing too much attention to myself. I don't think I realized how much I was adjusting at the time, but looking back, I can see how aware I had become of the emotional environment around me and how quickly I learned to respond to it. When you grow up moving between different emotional climates like that, you develop a kind of sensitivity that runs deep. You learn how to sense what's needed in the room. You learn how to shift, how to soften, and how to become the version of yourself that keeps things steady. And none of that feels like a problem when you're living it. It feels like maturity. It feels like being considerate. It feels like being someone that people can count on. But underneath all of that, something else was taking shape. What I learned, without anyone ever saying it out loud, was that taking up space had the potential to bring emotional volatility with it. And for a kid, that's a lot to carry. So I made an internal agreement that I didn't even realize I was making at the time. If I stayed quiet, things stayed calmer. If I gave the answer that was expected, things didn't escalate. And if I didn't bring my full thoughts or feelings into the room, I could avoid the reaction that might come with them. And honestly, it worked, at least on the surface. I became someone who could move through environments without creating disruption, someone who knew how to keep the peace. But what I didn't realize at the time was I wasn't avoiding conflict. I was slowly learning how to disconnect from the parts of myself in order to stay safe. And one of the deepest pieces of that for me was the fear of disappointment. Not just doing something wrong, but being disappointing. Because those feel very different when you're on the receiving end of them. Doing something wrong feels fixable. You can correct it, adjust it, try again. But feeling like you are a disappointment lands somewhere much deeper. It makes you start to question not just your choices, but your worth. And when that belief starts to settle in, you don't just try to make better decisions, you start trying to make yourself smaller. What's interesting is that this didn't stay in childhood. It didn't just fade out as I got older or become something I naturally grew out of. It followed me quietly and consistently into adulthood. And because it had been there for so long, it didn't feel like a pattern I had learned. It just felt like my personality. It showed up in the way I interacted with people, in the way I processed decisions, in the way I moved through rooms where I wasn't completely sure of my footing. I've always been someone who cares deeply about people. That part is very real. But what I didn't realize for a long time is how much of that care was tied to a fear of becoming a disruption or a disappointment. Those two things have probably been the strongest undercurrents in how I show up. Because being a disruption feels like risking conflict, and being a disappointment feels like something deeper entirely, like you've somehow gotten it wrong at the level of who you are and not just what you did. So when those things are when those are the things you're trying to avoid, you start to move through life a little differently. You hesitate before you speak. You rehearse things in your head before you say them out loud. You wait until you're absolutely sure before offering an idea, and even then, you might still soften it or qualify it just in case it doesn't land well. And if I'm being really honest, there are still moments where I can feel that happen in real time, especially in group settings. There's this split second where my brain goes completely blank, like everything I just knew walked out of the room without me. It's that deer in headlights feeling where you're suddenly aware that people are looking at you, waiting for you to respond, and your system just freezes for a second before trying to decide the safest way forward. And I've often learned how to work with that over time. I slow myself down. I give myself a second to think instead of rushing to fill the silence. But that internal reaction is still there, even now. It shows up in leadership spaces too, which is interesting because those are environments where I actually have something to offer. I'm part of a small leadership team at our church, and I'm surrounded by people who are supportive and encouraging. These are the safe people, the people I trust, the people who genuinely want to hear what I have to say. And in some ways, that makes it easier. But in other ways, it makes it much harder because I care so much about them. Their opinions matter to me. Their responses matter to me deeply. And when you care deeply about the people in the room, the weight of what you say can feel heavier, not lighter. It's not just about sharing an idea, it's about how that idea will be received by the people that you value. So I find myself navigating that tension. I can speak, and I do speak, but there's often still this internal filter running at the same time. Is it clear enough? Is this helpful? Is this worth saying? Is this going to land in the right way? Is this not as smart as what they're talking about? And if there's any uncertainty, my natural instinct is to pull back still, to wait, to listen, and to let someone else go first. Or if I do share, I might over-explain it. I'll add extra content, extra reasoning, extra layers to make sure that it makes sense. Almost like I'm trying to build a case for why what I'm saying is valid before anyone has any chance to question it. And if someone disagrees, most of the time I won't push back. Even if I still believe what I said, even if I know that there's more I could add, sometimes I can feel this part of me that would rather step back than risk creating tension or being misunderstood. And again, none of this feels dramatic when you're living it. It just feels like being thoughtful, being careful, being someone who doesn't need to dominate the conversation. But when I step back and look at the pattern as a whole, I can see that it's not just about personality. It's about protection. It's about a system that learned a long time ago to stay small, that staying small was safer than being fully seen. And what's been both challenging and eye-opening for me is realizing that this doesn't show up in the places where I feel unsure. It can show up even in the places where I feel the most at home, even with the people I trust, even in environments that are genuinely safe, which tells me that this isn't about the room that I'm in. It's about what I learned to do in order to survive in the rooms that I was in before. I don't think there was a single moment where all of this became obvious to me. It wasn't like a light switch flipped and suddenly I could see that pattern clearly. It's been much slower than that. More like something that has unfolded over time as I've paid closer attention to how I respond in certain situations and how those responses feel in my body. I started noticing it in small moments first. The hesitation before speaking, the way I would second guess something after I'd already said it, the internal replay of conversations where I wonder if I said too much or not enough or the wrong thing entirely. For a long time, I assumed that was normal. I thought it was part of being thoughtful or self-aware and maybe even just a part of being an introvert. But the more I paid attention, the more I realized this isn't just awareness. There was a weight to it, a quiet pressure to get it right, and underneath that, a fear that I might step out of line of what was acceptable or expected and create a reaction I didn't know how to manage. Once I could see that, I couldn't unsee it. It started showing up everywhere, not just in the bigger conversations, but in the small decisions, in the way I would soften my words or hold back a thought until I felt completely sure of it, or chose silence simply because it felt easier than navigating what might come after. And I think one of the hardest realizations for me has been understanding what I thought was peace wasn't always peace. It looked like peace on the outside. Things stayed calm, there wasn't conflict, and there weren't big reactions to manage, but internally there was still a lot happening. There was tension, restraint, a constant awareness of how I was being perceived and how to stay within the lines of that. I've had to sit with that reality, with the reality that what I learned wasn't just how to be peaceful. I learned how to disappear in certain spaces. Not completely, and not in a way that anyone would necessarily notice right away, but in quieter ways, in the parts of me that stayed hidden, in the thoughts that never made it out of my mouth, in the version of myself that felt the safest to present, even when it wasn't the most honest one. That's a hard thing to name because it doesn't feel dramatic. It feels subtle. It feels reasonable, like something that could easily be explained away as a personality or a preference. But when I sit with it honestly, I can see that it's been shaping more than just how I communicate. It's been shaping how I see myself. And what I'm slowly learning is that awareness like this isn't something to rush past. It's not something to fix overnight. It's something to stay with, to notice without judgment, and to hold with more compassion than I might have before. Because this didn't just come from nowhere. It came from a younger version of me who was trying to navigate environments that felt unpredictable and overwhelming, and who found a way to move through them that worked at the time. That version of me wasn't weak. She was paying attention. She was adapting. She was doing what she needed to do to stay steady in spaces that didn't always feel safe. And now, as I'm beginning to see it more clearly, I'm trying not to rush that part of me away. I'm trying to understand her. Because I think that's where this kind of change actually begins, not in forcing ourselves to suddenly take up space in ways that feel unnatural or overwhelming, but in gently recognizing where we learned not to, and beginning to slowly make room for something different. As I've been walking through this, I keep thinking how often this pattern shows up in ways that don't immediately stand out. And maybe your story doesn't look exactly like mine. The environments might have been different. The details might not line up in the same way. But that underlying instinct, the one that says it's safer to stay small than to risk being fully seen, has a way of showing up in more places than we realize. Sometimes it even hides inside things that look good on the surface. It can look like kindness, like being the person who is always considerate, always aware of how others are feeling, always willing to adjust so that things stay comfortable for everyone else. And there's real beauty in that, don't get me wrong. Caring deeply about people is not something to dismiss or undo. But sometimes what sits underneath that kindness is a constant self-editing, a quiet awareness of the room, a subtle shift in tone, a decision to hold something back because it feels easier than explaining it or risking how it might be received. Over time, that can start to feel normal. You can become the one who doesn't need much, the one who goes with the flow, the one who is easy to be around because you're not asking anyone to stretch or adjust. And sometimes that gets labeled as maturity. You're the calm one, the steady one, the one who doesn't get pulled into the drama. And those are good qualities. But there's a difference between choosing peace and avoiding anything that might disrupt it. One comes from a place of security, and the other often comes from a place of fear. Fear of being misunderstood, fear of being rejected, fear of disappointing someone else whose opinion matters to you. When that fear is running quietly in the background, it starts to shape how you show up in ways that are easy to miss. You might find yourself over-explaining, not because you don't trust what you're saying, but because you're trying to make sure that it's received well. You're trying to close every possible gap so there's no room for confusion or maybe pushback. Or you might stay quiet in conversations where you actually have something to add, simply because stepping into that space feels heavier than letting it pass. You might even notice that you can handle making a mistake, but the idea of disappointing someone feels almost unbearable. None of that means there's something wrong with you. It means you learned how to navigate your environment in ways that made sense at the time. You became attentive and aware. You learned how to read people and respond in ways that kept things steady. Those are not flaws. But when those patterns stay in place for a long time, they can start to shape your identity in ways that feel limiting. You begin to associate being loved with being easy, being accepted with being agreeable, and being safe with being quiet. And the hard part is that you can carry those beliefs into spaces that are actually safe, into relationships where people genuinely want to hear you, into environments where your voice would be welcomed, not rejected, and you still find yourself holding back, still filtering, still shrinking. Not because you have to, but because it's what you learn to do. And I think that's why it matters to talk about this, because sometimes the first step isn't changing anything, it's just seeing it clearly, recognizing what it feels like what feels like personality might actually be a pattern, one that made sense once, but may not be something that you have to keep carrying the same way anymore. There's a part of me that wishes I could go back and sit with that younger version of myself for a little while, not to change anything and not to tell her to be louder or braver than she was ready to be, but just to let her know that she wasn't wrong for paying attention. She wasn't wrong for noticing what felt safe and what didn't, and she wasn't wrong for learning to move through her world in a way that kept things steady. That's what she needed at the time, even if it came at a cost that she would never could have understood yet. I think that's something I'm still learning now, just in a different way. Awareness doesn't mean that something is wrong. It simply means I can see it now. I can see it doesn't require me to rush into becoming someone completely different overnight. It just gives me the opportunity to notice where I have a choice, where I might say something a little more than I used to, or let something stand without over-explaining it, or stay present in a moment instead of immediately adjusting myself to fit it. Not perfectly and not all at once, but a little differently than before. Because I don't think the goal here is to swing to the opposite extreme. I don't think it's about going from shrinking to suddenly forcing yourself to take up space in ways that feel unnatural or overwhelming. That kind of shift might look strong from the outside, but it doesn't always come from a place that's actually steady. What I'm learning is something quieter than that, something more grounded. It looks like learning how to be present as I am without immediately editing myself down. It looks like trusting that my voice has a place, even when it feels unfamiliar to use it. It looks like understanding that peace isn't something I have to earn by disappearing. It's something I can carry with me, even as I begin to show up more honestly. And I'm still very much in that process. There are still moments where I feel the hesitation, where I notice myself starting to pull back, where it would feel easier to stay quiet and let something pass. But there are also moments now where I pause and choose a little differently. I stay in the conversation a little longer. I say the thing that I might have held back before. I let it land without trying to manage what happens next. Those moments don't have to be big to matter. They just have to be honest. And for most of my life, I learned to shrink to keep the peace. And now slowly, I'm learning how to grow and take up space and tell the story that God trusted me to carry. If this resonated with you, you might want to go back and sit with episode 18, when your voice feels hard to find. It holds the same idea in a slightly different way, especially around what it looks like to reconnect with your voice without pressure. Thank you for being here with me today. I don't take it lightly that you would spend your time in a space like this, especially when the conversations are this personal and close to the surface. My hope is that you always leave feeling a little more seen, a little less alone, and a little more steady than you started. If this episode connected with you, one of the simplest ways you can support the podcast is by following it on whatever app you're listening on. If you're newer to podcasts, you can usually just search Healer and Hope Giver using the ampersand symbol and tap the follow button so new episodes show up for you each week. We release new episodes every Monday with shorter devotionals on Thursday, so there's always something here to come back to when you need it. If this conversation is something you want to sit with a little longer, there's a companion guide available for this episode. It's simply a space to process some of what we talked about. Nothing heavy, nothing overwhelming, just a place to reflect at your own pace if that's helpful for you. The link is in the show notes. You can also find the podcast on YouTube if that's an easier place for you to listen, or share it with someone else. And if you know someone who might need this conversation, sending them this episode is one of the most meaningful ways you can help this space grow. And if you're someone who likes processing things a little more deeply, there's also a free 7-day devotional called Quiet Authority, linked in the show notes. It is just a simple, steady place to continue this kind of work in your own time. Thank you again for being here, and I'll meet you back here next time.